Nobody on Ward 7 knew where Mara Delgado had come from. She had materialized on the neurological floor of Bethesda Naval Medical Center on a gray February morning. Her credentials impeccable, her manner unreadable, and her eyes carrying the specific, haunted stillness of someone who had seen things that couldn't be unseen. The senior nursing staff assumed she was a contract hire pulled from some specialized rehabilitation agency to cover the shortfall. The attending physicians assumed she was someone else's problem. Nobody thought to look closer. Nobody thought to ask why a trauma nurse with a combat medicine background had requested the one assignment in the entire hospital that every other qualified candidate had quietly, desperately refused: the permanent bedside care of Lieutenant Commander Eli Grayson, age 29, son of 4-star Admiral Thomas Grayson, and the most high-profile vegetative patient in the United States military healthcare system. Nobody asked those questions until the day she woke him up. Room 714 at the end of the neurological ward existed in its own particular kind of silence. Not the comfortable silence of an empty chapel or the peaceful silence of a sleeping child. It was a pressurized silence, the silence of held breath, of machines doing the work of a brain that had simply stopped performing its most basic, irreplaceable functions. Lieutenant Commander Eli Grayson had been in that room for 11 months. 11 months since the Black Hawk had gone down in the Panjshir Valley. 11 months since the rescue team had pulled him from the wreckage, his skull fractured in 3 places, his brain swollen against its casing like a fist inside a closed hand. 11 months of EEGs that showed minimal activity. 11 months of neurosurgeons in expensive shoes speaking in careful, measured tones to a father who had once commanded an entire theater of special operations and who now sat in a plastic hospital chair every Sunday afternoon, holding his son's unresponsive hand, looking entirely breakable. The previous nurses had lasted, on average, 3 weeks. It wasn't the workload. Eli's physical care was demanding but manageable, repositioning every 2 hours to prevent pressure sores, passive range of motion exercises, tube feeding, meticulous respiratory monitoring. Experienced neurological nurses handled far more complex caseloads every day. It was the weight of the room. It was watching a decorated combat veteran, a man who had led SEAL teams through the most brutal operational environments in the world, lying motionless with a feeding tube and a ventilator cuff while his father stared at him with an expression of grief so profound it felt almost intrusive to witness. It was the way Admiral Grayson would sometimes lean forward in his plastic chair, place his weathered hands on the bed rail, and speak quietly to his son about ordinary things. A baseball game he had watched, a story from Eli's childhood, a phone call from Eli's college roommate who still checked in every week. And the way Eli never, ever responded. 3 nurses had requested transfers. 2 had taken medical leave. 1 had simply called in sick one Thursday and never come back. Mara Delgado arrived on a Tuesday. She was 34, compact, and quietly athletic in a way that suggested functional strength rather than recreation. Her dark hair was pulled back with institutional efficiency, not a strand out of place. She wore her scrubs with the same no-nonsense precision as someone accustomed to wearing gear that needed to stay on under pressure. Her orientation file listed her previous employment as a traveling neurological rehabilitation nurse. Her educational background included a BSN from the University of Texas, a postgraduate certificate in traumatic brain injury rehabilitation, and 2 years of clinical experience at the Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio. What the orientation file did not list was the 6 years between her nursing degree and her position at Brooke Army. What it did not mention was the reason she had specific, detailed knowledge of a classified SEAL training protocol called persistent auditory orientation therapy, a technique developed in the black budget research programs of the Naval Special Warfare Command and almost entirely unknown outside the Tier 1 Special Operations medical community. What it did not explain was why, on her very first morning in room 714, Mara Delgado stood beside Eli Grayson's bed for a full 4 minutes before she touched anything. She stood perfectly still, studying the EEG printouts tacked to the corkboard, reading the 11 months of nursing notes stacked in the physical chart with the focused, rapid efficiency of someone who processed data the way other people breathed. She looked at the angle of the room's single window and the way the afternoon light fell. She noted the positioning of the ventilator, the tree, the patient call system, and the emergency crash cart in the corner. Then she looked at Eli, really looked at him. She pulled a small penlight from her breast pocket and checked his pupillary response. She lifted each eyelid gently and watched the pupils contract. Sluggish but present. She pressed her thumb firmly against his nail bed. A flicker in his jaw. Minimal but real. She placed 2 fingers against the left side of his neck, below the jaw, just ahead of the sternocleidomastoid, and held them there for 60 full seconds, counting something internally. Then she said, quietly but clearly, directly toward his ear, "Lieutenant Commander, I'm your new nurse. My name is Mara. I'm not going anywhere." The EEG on the wall monitor didn't spike. The ventilator kept its rhythm. The room was as silent as it had always been. But Mara Delgado pulled her chair up to the left side of the bed, not the right side, as every previous nurse had done, sat down, opened his chart to the very first page, and began again from the beginning. Dr. Prionaire had been the attending neurologist on Eli Grayson's case for 9 of the 11 months he had been in Ward 7. She was brilliant, measured, and had long ago made her private peace with the prognosis. The Glasgow Coma Scale assessments had been consistent for months. The MRI imaging showed diffuse axonal injury across multiple cortical regions. The brain, she had explained carefully to Admiral Grayson on 4 separate occasions, was not simply an organ that could be encouraged or persuaded. It was a structure that had sustained catastrophic mechanical damage. Certain pathways were simply no longer available. She had not yet met the new nurse. That changed on Mara's 4th morning in room 714. Dr. Nair arrived at 7:15 a.m. for her morning assessment, coffee in hand, a stack of new imaging requests tucked under her elbow. She pushed open the door to room 714 and immediately stopped. The room had been rearranged, not dramatically, not in a way that disrupted any equipment or clinical workflow, but with a deliberate, purposeful precision that was unmistakably intentional. Eli's bed had been rotated slightly, angling him toward the window rather than the monitoring bank. The overhead fluorescent light had been dimmed and replaced with a warm lamp positioned at his left periphery. On the bedside table, where a previous nurse had kept a water pitcher and a box of gloves, there was now a small Bluetooth speaker playing something that wasn't music. It was a soundscape. Wind, the low, distant rhythm of helicopter rotors, the ambient noise of an operating room. Mara was positioned at Eli's left side, speaking directly into his left ear in a low, calm, completely steady voice. She was recounting a SEAL mission briefing format, not a specific mission, a structure, entry, objective, egress, contingency. The language of a world Eli Grayson had lived in since he was 23 years old. Dr. Nair stood in the doorway for 30 seconds before she spoke. "What are you doing?" Mara didn't startle. She looked up with the unruffled composure of someone who had expected the question and had already decided how to answer it. "Persistent auditory orientation therapy," Mara said. "Left hemisphere dominant auditory stimulation combined with operationally familiar linguistic patterning. His EEG shows marginally higher theta wave activity between 0600 and 0800, which correspond with elevated cortisol from circadian rhythm maintenance. I'm working in that window." Dr. Nair stared at her. "I'm not familiar with that protocol." "Most civilian neurologists aren't," Mara said without a trace of condescension. She stood, smoothing Eli's blanket with practiced care. It was developed through SOCM's Traumatic Brain Injury Research Program about 6 years ago. The foundational theory is that for patients with intact subcortical function, which his EEG suggests he has, familiar operationally coded language patterns can bypass damaged cortical regions and access preserved limbic and brainstem pathways. You speak the brain's native language. The brain's native language, Dr. Nair repeated slowly. Whatever it was doing for the longest, most intensely, under the most emotionally significant circumstances, Mara said simply. For Eli Grayson, that's mission protocol. 11 years of sealed training and combat deployment. That language is encoded deeper than anything else he ever learned. There was a long silence in the room, broken only by the soft rhythm of the ventilator and the distant sound of the soundscape from the small speaker. Where did you learn this? Dr. Nair asked. Mara picked up the nursing chart, clicked her pen open, and began documenting the morning's assessment. I read a lot, she said. Dr. Nair stood in the doorway for a moment longer. Then she looked at Eli's EEG monitor. The theta wave readout was marginally, almost imperceptibly elevated. She had reviewed his chart that morning before entering the room. Yesterday's reading had been lower. She didn't say anything else. But she didn't tell Mara to stop, either. Admiral Thomas Grayson arrived every Sunday at 1 p.m. He always wore civilian clothes on those visits, a deliberate and studied act of normalcy. Khakis, a flannel shirt, a jacket that had belonged to Eli as a teenager that was roughly the same size, because both of them were built to the same geometric specifications, broad and hard-angled and immovable looking. He always brought the same thing, a thermos of black coffee for himself, because the hospital's was undrinkable, and a small Norfolk pine sapling in a plastic pot that he set on Eli's windowsill. He had been doing this every week for 11 months. The nursing staff had, in a moment of collective kindness, begun watering the trees when he wasn't there. There were now 7 of them lined up along the window, small and perfectly green, an incongruous little forest growing in the neurological ward. The Sunday after Mara's first week, Admiral Grayson pushed open the door to room 714 and stopped. The nurse was there. He was accustomed to catching whichever staff member was on duty, but what made him stop wasn't her presence. It was what she was saying. She was reciting the SEAL etiquette code, not in a performative way, not reading it off a card. She was saying it from memory in the specific, cadenced meter of someone who had internalized it as both doctrine and identity. In times of war or uncertainty, there is a special breed of warrior ready to answer our nation's call, Mara was saying, her voice low and direct, positioned at Eli's left ear. A common man with uncommon desire to succeed. Grayson recognized every word. He had read them at his son's commissioning ceremony. He had quoted them at a memorial service for 3 of his son's teammates the previous year. He had a framed print of the code in his office at the Pentagon that he had stopped being able to look at after the Panjshir Valley. He stood in the doorway for the entire recitation. He didn't move. He didn't speak. His hand gripped the door frame hard enough that his knuckles went white. When Mara finished, she looked up and saw him standing there. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain or look embarrassed. She simply held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at Eli, then back to the Admiral with an expression that was difficult to read, not cold, but intensely focused. The expression of someone in the middle of a very long mission. "I'll give you your time, sir," she said, moving to collect her chart. "How long have you been doing that?" Grayson asked. His voice was completely controlled, completely flat. The voice of a man who had trained himself never to betray vulnerability in front of anyone, which was a mask that was visibly, painfully costing him something. "Every morning during his high theta window," Mara replied, "and twice in the afternoon with operational soundscaping." Grayson looked at his son for a long moment. "The last neurologist told me there was no evidence that he can hear any of it." "There's no evidence he can't," Mara said. "The absence of a measurable cortical response doesn't mean there's no subcortical processing. It means our instruments aren't sensitive enough to measure what might be happening in the areas that are still functioning." Grayson looked at her then, really looked at her, with the same evaluating intensity that she had applied to Eli's chart on her first morning. The Admiral had spent 30 years reading people. He had sat across the table from foreign intelligence operatives, hostile government officials, and lying congressional committee members. He was exceptionally good at detecting the specific weight of someone who was carrying a secret. "Who are you?" he asked. "Mara Delgado," she said. "I'm your son's nurse." Grayson nodded slowly. He sat down in his plastic chair, unscrewed his thermos, and poured his coffee. "Tell me more about this technique," he said. And for the first time in 11 months, A conversation in room 714 lasted for 2.5 hours. Day 19. Dr. Prienair had begun stopping by room 714 before her official morning rounds. She told herself it was to check the monitoring data. She had started printing Eli's overnight EEG strips and comparing them day over day, keeping a separate log in a personal notebook she hadn't mentioned to her attending colleagues. The changes were small enough to be dismissed as instrumentation variants, but they were consistent. And in neurology, consistency meant something. Mara had escalated the protocol. She had introduced olfactory stimulus, a specific combination of scents aligned with the operational environments Eli's service records described. She had sourced recordings of desert wind patterns, the specific acoustic signature of a RHIB boat engine, the ambient radio traffic from a logistics base in a conflict zone. She had coordinated with the physical therapy team to adjust his passive movement sessions to align with his EEG windows so that proprioceptive input was occurring simultaneously with auditory stimulation. She had also, without explanation, moved his feeding schedule. "Why did you change the tube feed timing?" The day shift charge nurse, a senior nurse named Howard Kim, asked on day 17 with barely concealed irritation. Howard had 17 years of neurological nursing experience and very specific opinions about workflow disruption. His cortisol cycle, Mara said simply, if the body is processing a feeding bolus during the stimulation window, metabolic resources are redirected to the gut. I want maximum available glucose for neural activity during the theta window. Howard stared at her. That's not a recognized clinical protocol. It's basic physiology, Mara replied, without looking up from her documentation. Howard opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at Eli's morning EEG strip, which was sitting on the counter. He picked it up. He looked at yesterday's strip, which he had happened to keep from the morning filing. He put them down and walked away without another word. On the morning of day 19, Mara was 40 minutes into the left hemisphere auditory session. She was using a different register that morning. Not the code, not the mission briefings, but something more personal. She had spent the previous evening reviewing a form of PAOD she had only used twice before, a variation that incorporated biographical anchoring. Operationally significant personal memories, not just professional schema. The theory was that in patients with preserved subcortical limbic connectivity, emotionally charged autobiographical memory might create stronger activation than procedural or professional language alone. She was talking about a specific dive, a night dive in Puget Sound, based on a training record she had pulled from his service file. His first solo open water navigation dive as a SEAL trainee. The record noted that he had surfaced 40 minutes early, having completed the course in record time in zero visibility conditions using only a compass and touch navigation. His evaluating officer had noted in the margin natural aquatic orientation, exceptional spatial memory, even in total sensory deprivation. Mara was describing cold Pacific water and starless sky and a specific weight of a dive rig at depth. And Eli Grayson moved his left hand. It wasn't a reflex arc. It wasn't the kind of small motor movement that occasionally occurred in vegetative patients as muscle memory or autonomic activity. It was a deliberate, reaching movement. His left hand, which had been lying flat and open on the mattress beside him, slowly closed. His fingers curled inward. His fist tightened. Mara stopped speaking. She watched his hand for 4 full seconds. Her heart rate, by her own intensive training, barely changed. Her face didn't change. Her breathing remained entirely controlled. Then she leaned forward very slowly and placed her hand palm up beneath his closed fist. "Eli," she said. Her voice was utterly calm. "If you can hear me, squeeze." 3 seconds of silence. Then Eli Grayson's fingers tightened around her hand with the slow, grinding force of a man waking from the deepest sleep of his life. Howard Kim found Mara standing at the nursing station at 7:48 a.m., filling out a rapid neurological change form with the composed efficiency of someone filing routine paperwork, except her handwriting was slightly, almost imperceptibly faster than usual. Howard took one look at her face, at the absolute, ruthlessly controlled absence of expression on it, and his stomach dropped. What happened? He asked. Purposeful motor response to verbal command in the left hand, Mara said. Sustained grip on command for approximately 8 seconds. Repeated twice. Documented on the change form. I need Dr. Nair paged immediately. Howard grabbed the phone. The next 45 minutes in room 714 were the most concentrated electric period of organized medical activity the room had ever seen. Dr. Nair arrived in 6 minutes, followed by the neurosurgery resident on call, followed by 2 technicians with portable imaging equipment, followed by a specialist in coma emergence from the 4th floor who had been eating breakfast in the cafeteria and arrived still holding a coffee cup. They ran every assessment. GCS motor subscale. Eye tracking responses. Command following trials. They paged stimuli from different angles. They tested both hands, both feet. They checked EEG activity in real time. Eli Grayson was not conscious. He was not awake in any meaningful sense. But he was responding, inconsistently, partially with enormous effort and enormous gaps, but responding. Motor commands in the left hand, a subtle, tracking movement of his eyes towards sound. What looked, in one extraordinary moment, like the beginning of a facial expression. Dr. Nair stood at the foot of the bed with her arms crossed and stared at the EEG readout for a very long time without speaking. 11 months, she finally said. It wasn't a question. It was the specific intonation of a scientist encountering a data point that requires the entire model to be recalibrated. He was never completely gone, Mara said quietly, from her position at Eli's left side. She hadn't moved from that position during the entire assessment period. She had simply stood there, steady and present, occasionally speaking a low, orienting phrase into his left ear while the medical team worked. The pathways were damaged. That doesn't mean they were severed. We ran every standard stimulation protocol in the first 3 months, the neurosurgery resident said, looking at Mara with an expression caught somewhere between professional skepticism and undeniable awe. Bilateral, standard auditory stimulation, tactile, olfactory. Nothing. Standard protocol addresses the damaged cortical regions, Mara replied. This technique routes around them. You don't drive through the collapsed bridge. You find a ford. Dr. Nair turned to look at her fully. The specialist from the 4th floor was looking at her too. The room had gone quiet again, but it was a completely different quality of quiet than the one that had occupied it for 11 months. It was the kind of quiet that gathered around something important. Where did you actually learn this? Dr. Nair asked. Mara held the neurologist's gaze for a moment. Then she looked down at Eli's hand, at the slight curl of his fingers that was, arguably, oriented very slightly toward the hand she had placed at the edge of the mattress. I need to call the Admiral, Mara said. Admiral Thomas Grayson arrived at Bethesda Naval Medical Center at 11:14 a.m. on a Wednesday, 4 days ahead of his usual Sunday visit. He walked into the hospital with 4 members of his security detail and his senior aide, and he cleared the corridor outside room 714 of everyone except Drive Nair and Mara Delgado within approximately 3 minutes of arriving. He stood at his son's bedside. He watched the neurologist demonstrate the command response protocol. He watched Eli's left hand respond to a verbal command, slower this time, less defined but present. He watched his son's eyes track weakly toward the source of a sound. For a long time, Admiral Grayson said nothing at all. Then he sat down in his plastic chair, placed his hands flat on his knees, and looked at Mara. Tell me everything, he said. And this time, don't tell me you read it somewhere. The room was silent. Dr. Nair looked between them, sensing the shift in weight of the conversation. Mara pulled the chair from the corner, placed it on the opposite side of Eli's bed, and sat down. She looked at the Admiral with the steady, clear eyes of someone who had rehearsed this moment for a long time and was finally ready to stop rehearsing. My name is Mara Delgado, she began. That part is true. I've been a registered nurse for 6 years, and that's true too. She paused. What's not in my personnel file is the 6 years before that. I enlisted in the Navy at 22. I became a hospital corpsman attached to a special operations support element. I deployed 3 times, twice to Afghanistan, once to a theater I'm not going to name in this room. I spent 4 years embedded with SEAL and Marine Raider units in forward operating environments, primarily in the role of combat medical support. I was honorably discharged at 28 after a mission incident that I'm also not going to name in this room. And during my third deployment, I participated in a DoD-funded research program run through Naval Special Warfare Command's Medical Research Division. Grayson's eyes hadn't moved from her face. That program, Mara continued, was studying traumatic brain injury recovery in elite operators who had experienced blast trauma. We lost too many guys to delayed vegetative decline after IED injuries. Men who survived the initial blast and the immediate medical crisis and then just drifted into the gray. And the standard civilian neurology toolkit wasn't pulling them back. The program developed an alternative stimulation approach based on the observation that operators whose loved ones used mission-specific language in familiar operational environments during bedside care showed measurably better arousal and emergence outcomes than those who received purely medical or purely personal communication. The brain, we hypothesized, responds most strongly to the inputs it was most intensively trained to process. She stopped. Grayson leaned forward. Why didn't you present this protocol to the medical team 11 months ago? Why didn't SOCOM's Medical Research Division present it? Because the program was discontinued after the deployment incident I mentioned, Mara said quietly. The research lead was killed. Most of the participant data was classified at a level that prevents clinical use in standard medical settings. And I wasn't in a position to go through official channels. Why not? Mara looked at Eli for a moment. At his face, peaceful in its terrible stillness, but slightly, just very slightly, less absolute than it had been 19 days ago. Because the mission incident, she said, was the Panjshir Valley. I was the forward corpsman on the secondary extraction element for your son's unit. The silence in room 714 was total. Dr. Nair went very still. I wasn't on the helicopter that went down, Mara said, her voice entirely controlled, but carrying an undercurrent of something that had clearly been carried for a very long time. My element extracted with the primary team. Eli's bird was hit during egress. I watched it go down from the secondary exfil point. She stopped. I've had 11 months to go through every official channel to bring this protocol to his medical team. I spent 10 of those months being told the research data was classified. The program never existed on paper, and the protocol had no peer-reviewed clinical basis. So you became his nurse instead, Grayson said. I became his nurse instead, Mara confirmed. I got my civilian nursing license. I got a clinical position at Brook to establish my neurological rehabilitation credentials. And I requested this assignment. The Admiral looked at his son for a long, heavy moment. When he looked back at Mara, his expression had shifted in a way that was difficult to define. Not warmer, exactly. Something more complex than that. The particular look of a man recalibrating a very large, very important judgment. The neurologist, Grayson said, Dr. Nair, she's seeing changes. Dr. Nair spoke for the first time in several minutes. Documented purposeful motor response. Measurable EEG activity changes over 19 days. I've never seen anything like it in an 11-month-old vegetative presentation. She paused. I'm not ready to make any prognosis statements, but I'm prepared to say that something is different. Something changed when she walked in this room. Grayson looked at Mara for a long, still moment. What do you need? He said. They gave her everything she asked for. A modified room, quiet, the overhead fluorescence permanently dimmed, the acoustic properties of the space altered with sound-dampening panels that Dr. Nair had pulled out of a research budget she had quietly redirected. A formal protocol documentation process so that the technique could be applied consistently across the full nursing rotation, not only during Mara's shifts. Access to Eli's complete service records, personal correspondence, and the recorded debriefs of his surviving teammates, so that the auditory stimulation sessions could be saturated with the specific, granular details of his actual lived experience rather than generic operational language. In time, Admiral Grayson called 3 people in the first 48 hours after Mara's disclosure. By the end of the week, the classified research data from the discontinued SOCOM program had been quietly and officially made available to Dr. Nair's team under a medical research exemption. It wasn't a miracle of bureaucracy. It was a four-star admiral making 4 phone calls with the calm, absolute authority of a man who had decided that no classification protocol was more important than his son's life. Mara worked with the same ferocious, measured intensity she brought to everything. She didn't celebrate the early responses. She documented them, calibrated against them, and built the next phase of the protocol on top of them. She was disciplined with herself in a way that unsettled some of the other staff. She never seemed jubilant, never seemed broken, never seemed anything except focused. Howard Kim, who had gone from quietly hostile to quietly awed over the course of 3 weeks, asked her once if she ever just felt things about what was happening in room 714. All the time, Mara said, without breaking her documentation rhythm, "I just don't do it here." Week 4. Eli Grayson opened his eyes. Not fully, not with clarity, not with recognition. It was the specific, effortful, partial opening of a man climbing back from an enormous depth, the eyes still unfocused and clouded and uncomprehending. But they opened to sound, to Mara's voice specifically in the left hemisphere auditory session, and they stayed open for 11 minutes before the effort became too great and he drifted back down. Dr. Nair documented it as a clinically significant emergence indicator. She also, for the first time in 11 months, used the phrase cautious optimism in her attending notes. For Dr. Nair, who had learned to never, ever use that phrase in TBI cases, it was roughly equivalent to anyone else doing a backflip down a corridor. Week 6. Eli tracked his father's voice. Admiral Grayson had been incorporated into the protocol sessions. Mara had spent several evenings coaching him on the specific language patterns and operational framing that produced the strongest EEG responses. The Admiral, who had built his entire career on projecting authority and control in high-stakes situations, had sat across a hospital break room table from a 34-year-old Navy corpsman turned nurse and taken instruction with a focus and humility that had made Dr. Nair, observing from the doorway, feel as if she were watching something quietly extraordinary. The first time Eli Grayson's eyes tracked toward his father's voice and held for more than a few seconds, Admiral Grayson pressed his mouth into a flat line, looked at the ceiling, breathed through his nose once, and then reached out and put his hand over his son's with the careful, deliberate tenderness of a man who didn't entirely trust himself to move quickly. "Welcome back, son," he said. His voice was rock steady. His hand was shaking. Week 9. Eli Grayson said a word. It was not a dramatic word. It was not "Dad" or "Where am I" or any of the things that would have made a better story. It was Czech, spoken in a gravelly, air-starved rasp in the middle of the PAOT session in the specific operational context of Team Radio Czech, because his brain had apparently decided to reassert itself using the precise language Mara had been feeding it for 9 weeks. But the nurses outside heard it. Howard Kim, who was passing the door with a medication tray, stopped walking. Dr. Nair, who had taken to spending her lunch breaks in the chair outside room 714 under the pretense of catching up on charting, put her pen down and stood up. Inside the room, Mara Delgado looked at Eli Grayson's slightly open, slightly focused, completely exhausted eyes, and she said, very quietly and very calmly, "Check. Solid. All elements accounted for." And Eli Grayson, 11 months and 9 weeks after a helicopter went into the ground in the Panjshir Valley, did something that no one in room 714 had seen before. He almost smiled. Week 14. Room 714 was not empty anymore. It had become, quietly and without formal announcement, something between a medical landmark and a pilgrimage site for a very specific set of visitors. 3 of Eli's former teammates had come separately, having heard through the invisible network that connects special operations units that something was happening. They had sat in the plastic chairs, some of them large enough to make the chairs look faintly absurd, and spoken to their lieutenant commander in the low, steady, operational cadences that Mara had briefed them on and had left looking lighter than when they came in. 2 researchers from Naval Special Warfare Medical had flown in to observe and document. A neurologist from Johns Hopkins had called Dr. Nair directly, having heard about the case through channels, asking with carefully masked excitement whether she would be willing to share data. Eli's recovery was not a straight line. No true TBI recovery ever is. There were bad days, days when the consciousness that was slowly, laboriously clawing its way back seemed to slip further down again, and the EEG would flatten, and the eyes would close, and the room would feel like November again. There were days when Mara sat in the chair at his left side and spoke with the same steadiness she always brought, and nothing moved and nothing changed, and she documented the absence of response with the same precision she documented the presence of it, and went home and did whatever it was she did alone in the off hours to keep herself together for the next shift. But the general direction was up. Week 14, Eli Grayson was breathing without the ventilator for 4-hour windows. He was producing consistent, purposeful motor responses in both hands. He was making eye contact, genuine eye contact, with recognition building slowly behind it like a light coming on in a distant window. He couldn't speak with any consistency yet, but he was tracking complex verbal stimuli and beginning to produce volitional facial expressions. His last neurological GCS assessment had moved him out of the vegetative state classification. The day that happened, Dr. Nair came to find Mara in the supply closet where she was restocking the crash cart inventory, and told her. Mara nodded, kept counting saline bags, and said, "Thank you." Dr. Nair stood in the doorway for a moment watching her, and then said, "You should feel something about this, you know? You're allowed." Mara set down the saline bag. She looked at the metal shelf in front of her for a moment. "I'll feel it when he says his father's name," she said. She went back to counting supplies. 3 days later, Admiral Thomas Grayson arrived at room 714 for his Sunday visit. He placed his small Norfolk pine on the windowsill, the 9th one now, a proper forest of them, green and resilient in the winter light, and sat in his chair. Mara was on the opposite side of the bed, completing her morning documentation. She looked up when the Admiral came in, acknowledged him with a nod, and continued writing. Grayson reached out and placed his hand over Eli's. Eli's eyes opened, fully, clearly, with recognition. He looked at his father's face for a long, complete moment. His throat moved. His jaw worked with the enormous effort of someone relearning a motor skill that should be automatic. "Dad," Eli Grayson said. It was barely a whisper. It was the sound of something extraordinary. Admiral Thomas Grayson, 4-star admiral, former commander of the Joint Special Operations Command, a man who had operated in the darkest theaters of the global war on terror, without flinching, closed his eyes. A single tear moved down his weathered face and dropped onto the back of his son's hand. Mara Delgado set down her pen. She looked at the Admiral and the Lieutenant Commander across the bed between them. She quietly gathered her chart and her documentation materials and moved to leave the room, giving them the privacy that the moment deserved. She was at the door when Eli's voice came again, slow and rough and enormously effortful, like a radio signal pushing through years of static. "Nurse," he rasped. Mara stopped, turned. Eli Grayson's eyes found her face across the room. They were clearer than she had ever seen them, still clouded with the residue of everything he had been through, still carrying the specific weight of a man who had been somewhere very far away for a very long time, but present, fully, genuinely present. "You stayed," he said. Mara looked at him for a moment. At this man she had watched breathe for 14 weeks. This man she had talked to every morning in the specific language of a world they had both once occupied, across the invisible distance of whatever gulf he had been lost in. "That's what we do," Mara said quietly. Admiral Grayson looked at her across his son's bed. He stood slowly, squaring his shoulders with the precise, unconscious bearing of a man who had spent 30 years in uniform. He raised his right hand in a crisp, unwavering military salute. Mara straightened. She returned it, sharp, precise, the salute of someone who had earned the right to give it. Then she walked out of room 714, down the length of Ward 7, past the nursing station where Howard Kim was watching with his arms crossed and an expression he wasn't quite managing to keep neutral, out through the double doors and into the gray February light of the hospital corridor beyond. She stood there for a moment with her back against the wall and her chart pressed against her chest. And then, in the empty corridor, alone and unobserved, Mara Delgado allowed herself to feel it. 6 months later, Dr. Priya Nair published the first peer-reviewed case study of persistent auditory orientation therapy in the Journal of Neurotrauma. She listed Mara Delgado as a primary contributing researcher. The paper was downloaded 40,000 times in its first month. Lieutenant Commander Eli Grayson was transferred to an outpatient rehabilitation program 7 months after the morning his hand first closed. His recovery was incomplete in some ways and would remain so. There were things he had lost in the Panjshir Valley that were not coming back, pathways too damaged to fully rebuild, gaps where memory should be. He would spend years in physical and cognitive rehabilitation, learning to navigate a body and a mind that had been, in the most fundamental sense, remade. But he walked out of Bethesda Naval Medical Center on a Thursday afternoon in September, slowly and with a cane and with his father's hand on his shoulder, into the late summer sunlight. Mara Delgado was not there. She had requested a transfer 6 weeks earlier, citing a position at a SOCOM-affiliated research facility working on the formal development of the peyote protocol for broader military medical application. Admiral Grayson had personally facilitated the appointment. Dr. Nair had written her a letter of reference that was, by the neurologist's own severe standards, embarrassingly effusive. On the day Eli left the hospital, there was a small envelope on his patient discharge paperwork. Inside was a single index card, handwritten, "Lieutenant Commander. The technique works because the brain doesn't forget what it was trained to do. Neither do we. Good hunting. MD." The last Norfolk pine on the windowsill of room 714 had been moved to the hallway outside, where the nursing staff had decided to keep it. Howard Kim watered it every morning before his shift. It was the tallest one. If this story gave you chills and reminded you that some battles are fought in silence, in a bedside chair, in the dark hours of a graveyard shift, hit that like button and share this with someone who needs to be reminded that the bravest people in the room aren't always the ones carrying weapons. Subscribe for more stories of extraordinary people doing impossible things in the places we least expect.